the thing with the 49ers are going to have to trade one of their receivers if they want to get something for him instead of just letting Aiyuk walk, because that's the logic behind they're going to trade him to the Steelers, is that they want to get something for him. They're trying to win the Super Bowl right now. I think they'd rather try and win the Super Bowl this year and risk losing Brandon Aiyuk for a 2026 compensatory pick than trade him for a 2025 whatever right now. That's getting kind of lost in everything. The Niners are trying to win a Super Bowl still. So I don't think that picking Ricky Pearsall in the first round portended any major change right now, because that major change was going to happen. It would have already happened. And the changes coming in the future have always been going to happen. Like they've been on that kind of course for a while now. So all of that is to say the McCaffrey extension doesn't matter. At least not for future financial plans.
Well,
because
it matters.
Go ahead.
Here's why. I mean, it matters because you make CMC whole. You make him, like you want to nurture relationships with your best players, and that's what this is moved towards.
Yeah, I just meant it doesn't matter from the like wide receiver room standpoint. But go on.
Yeah, and it clears cap space. The point I want to make, and this goes back to drafting Pearsall. This goes back to retaining Jennings and signing him to a 2-year extension. Sometimes it's not so complicated. Sometimes it's just, hey, we really like our receiving core and we want to keep these guys on affordable deals, and not everything is related, right? Like when the 49ers continued to invest premium resources in the defensive line, the thing was, it was the identity of the team. It was the identity of the defense. We're going to make sure that this is a strength of ours no matter what. If we're missing a dude or two because of injuries, then we have other elite talents, former first-round picks, high-level free agents, what have you, that we can plug in. And no matter what, we're going to be in a position to put a good defensive line on the field on any given game day, right? That's how I look at this receiver thing. It's like, man, if Deebo Samuel has to miss a month with a hamstring injury, okay, now you have a pretty like decent option and potentially in Ricky Pearsall coming in. Like there's not going to be a drop off, because how many times do we see it? Like just a reality of the league, when you're missing your best players, it's harder to win. It's just a lot harder to win. You can go back to all these different games over the last few years and the 49ers have lost. And you're like, oh, well, they didn't have Nick Bosa in that game against Atlanta. Or, oh, Richard Sherman in 2019 didn't play against that game. They didn't have K'Wan Williams in that game either. And then
against the
Falcons. And then Julio Jones went for, 1 million yards on 50 catches, right? Like there are these scenarios where, I mean, if you can maintain your strength, even when you're banged up at a certain position group, that can be really valuable. And sometimes it's just as easy as, all right, well, Brandon Aiyuk sprained his ankle and he's out for 6 weeks. So now we have Ricky Pearsall to step in, right? Instead of being this drop off. And I think there's logic in that. And I think there's also logic in looking at the long game and saying, more likely than not, beyond 2024, we're not going to have Deebo Samuel and Brandon Aiyuk. So let's have somebody else that we could potentially plug in who's been in the league for a year, and not somebody who's, now we're heaping all this pressure on them when we trade Deebo Samuel for the 23rd pick in the draft and then turn around and draft a receiver 23rd, because we saw how that didn't work out with Javon Kinlaw trying to replace DeForest Buckner.
Sure.
Right. So that's like, it's not like, oh gosh, the 49ers signed Juwan Jennings to a 2-year extension. That means that, they don't have any faith that Brandon Aiyuk's going to be going to sign his contract this summer, or they drafted Ricky Pearsall. That means the writing's on the wall. They're going to trade Brandon Aiyuk. Maybe if things go really, really south, that's what happens. But I just think they want to have good players and want to make sure that their receiving core is a strength, sort of no matter what. If Deebo Samuel has a groin injury and has to miss some time, or if Brandon Aiyuk, sprains an ankle or whatever, it's good to maintain a strength, even if guys get hurt. Like that's kind of the whole point here, in my opinion.
Yeah, not to mention just on the Pearsall pick specifically, because you said this and it dinged a bell in my head. If going into the draft, because I think part of the part of the reason the Pearsall pick was so jarring is A, the consensus draft board didn't have him as a first round pick. B, we were so caught up, the royal we, you, me, everybody was caught up. That's the definition of the royal we. Got so caught up in the offensive line thing and the right tackle thing. And history tells us, save for the Reuben Foster pick, which is an outlier because of he was going to go like top 10 and then he fell and the Niners thought that they could get good value there. And okay. But history tells us they're going to pick an offensive lineman, a defensive lineman, or a wide receiver in the first round or quarterback. But they weren't picking a quarterback, which left like defensive lineman, offensive lineman, and wide receiver. Well, it turns out the back end of the first round was not a good spot for this offensive line class, and they didn't like any of those dudes. So
As
that
we
leaves
talked about coming in.
right. So that leaves defensive lineman and wide receiver, and they liked the wide receiver available more than the best defensive lineman available, and so they went with that guy. Like, I think if you had told me, hey, they're not going to pick an offensive lineman in the first round, I would have gone with a defensive lineman and then wide receiver in predicting.
Yeah.
It's just, I think there's been a lot of overthinking on it.
A lot of overthinking.
Yeah.
A lot of overthinking.
Yeah.
Which we do all the time because
I stay overthinking.
well, just in life in general, for sure. But we in general, I mean, we host a podcast and are responsible for coming up with content and have to talk about draft picks for hours and hours on end. So obviously we're going to overthink, and we're not saying that, we're exempt from that. But I think just in general for team building, sometimes it's a lot more simple than it's talked about, right? Like sometimes it's just as simple as, yeah, we think he's good, and we want to have as many good receivers as we can.
Draft good players. I think that's a pretty good philosophy.
Like, it's been proven that Brock Purdy excels with good weapons. So let's make sure we have more good weapons for Brock Purdy.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty sound line of thinking.
Yeah.